In this module, we will look at the properties of solutions. The focus of this module will be on water, since it is the most important substance in the body. It makes up about 2/3 of the total body mass. Changes in the body's water content can be fatal because all physiological systems will be affected. Humans can live for a few weeks without food, but only a few days without water. Water has several important roles in the body. It is an effective lubricant, as it reduces the friction within the joints and in body cavities. Chemical reactions in the body occur in the water, and water molecules also participate in the physiological reactions. Water can regulate the body temperature through the release of sweat. Water can act as a solvent to create solutions. A proper balance of the water and electrolyte levels is essential for the body to function properly. This will be seen during the testing in the clinical labs. We will begin with what makes up a solution and why some substances dissolve in water while others don't. So what is a solution? It is a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances that is uniform throughout. In other words, no matter where you sample from the solution, the composition will be the same. It's like a cup of coffee where the first sip will be the same as the last sip. A solution is made up of two classes of materials, the solute and the solvent. The solute is the substance in lower quantities, and the solvent is the substance in the highest quantity. In the human body and all living things, the solvent is water. Water is essential as many physiological systems depend on it. Why is this? It's because of the polar nature of water. Remember that the polar oxygen-hydrogen bonds and the bent shape of the molecules makes water polar. It has a negative end around the oxygen atom and a positive end around the hydrogen atoms. The polarity of water allows it to interact with many substances, including other polar substances such as amino acids and ions that are released from essential electrolytes. Water molecules are attracted to one another because they are polar. The positive end of a water molecule will be attracted to the negative end of a neighboring molecule. So in this example here, we have the hydrogen, which has a partial positive charge, and it's attracted to a neighboring oxygen atom that has a partial negative charge. The result is the formation of a hydrogen bond, which, as you may recall, is a type of intermolecular force. Because of the polar nature of water, it is attracted to other polar molecules. One example is ethanol, which is found in alcoholic drinks. Since ethanol has a polar oxygen-hydrogen bond, as shown here, and the three-dimensional shape around the oxygen is bent, it actually makes the entire ethanol molecule polar. And so the result is the partial positively charged hydrogen of the ethanol molecules will be able to hydrogen bond with oxygen in water molecules. It is these strong intermolecular hydrogen bonding interactions that makes ethanol very soluble in water. In this picture, you can see how hydrogen bonding, represented by the dotted green lines, can occur between neighboring water molecules, between water and ethanol, or down here. And although it's not seen here, hydrogen bonding can also occur between ethanol molecules. One thing to take note of is that none of the covalent bonds are affected in these interactions. When ethanol and water are mixed, the covalent bonds of the molecules stay intact because they are very strong. There's not enough energy in the solution that would cause the bonds to break and the atoms to separate. If you are wondering what happens to ethanol after you consume an alcoholic drink, the ethanol molecules do not just fall apart the moment they are ingested. It will eventually interact with particular enzymes, which are proteins in the body. This in turn causes symptoms such as redness, increased heart rate, slowed reflexes, and other effects of being inebriated. Eventually, the body will convert the ethanol through chemical reactions into other substances, which will then be eliminated from the body as waste products. When salts are added to water, the crystals will eventually disappear. Why is that? Well, ionic compounds, also known as salts, will dissociate in water. We say that the salt is ionizing. Essentially, water molecules will pull the ions apart due to the attraction it has for the ions. The negatively charged anions will be attracted to the positive end of the water molecules, whereas the positively charged cations will be attracted to the negative ends of the water molecules. Because there is so much more water than the salt, the ions will eventually be surrounded by the water molecules in what is referred to as a hydration sphere. Since the ions are no longer packed closely together, then the salt crystals are no longer visible to the naked eye. Have a look at the following animation to help you visualize what is happening at the molecular level when a salt is dissolved in water. One of the characteristics of dissociated ions is that they are able to conduct electricity. Because of this, substances that can ionize in water are called electrolytes. Substances that completely or almost completely dissociate in water are referred to as strong electrolytes. And for substances where only a small amount dissociates are described as being weak electrolytes. Such solutions have very little ions present, so it would not conduct electricity very well. The strength of the electrolyte is important when we look at acids and bases later on in the module. You can test out the strength of the electrolytes by carrying out a simple test. In the image you see here, there's a break in the circuit so that the electrical current will not flow through the light bulb unless the circuit can be completed. In the case where there is a strong electrolyte dissolved in water, such as sodium chloride, the ions are able to carry the charge and give a brightly lit bulb. With a weak electrolyte, since there is only a small amount of dissociation, there are less ions in solution to carry the charge, which is why the light bulb is dim. So in this image here, you can see that most of the substance stays intact. Very few dissociate into ions, which is why the light bulb is dim. With substances that do not dissociate into ions, such as sugar, the light bulb would remain unlit. So here you can see that there are no ions present. These images here demonstrate how water alone, or salt crystals alone, will not be able to conduct electricity. It isn't until the salt is dissolved in water when the ions are freed and then subsequently able to carry the charge and light up the bulb. Substances that are attracted to water and dissolves readily in water are described as being hydrophilic, where hydro means water and philic means loving. Such substances include polar molecules and ions. The hydrophilic nature of these substances will result in the formation of hydration spheres. So here we have sodium chloride that has been dissolved in water, and each of the ions are surrounded by hydration spheres. Same goes for polar molecules such as glucose. Glucose has oxygen atoms in it, making the molecule polar. And so glucose molecules, because they are polar, will be attracted to water, and so they too will also be found in hydration spheres. Now that we understand why some substances dissolve in water, let's look at substances that do not, such as oil. Why is it that oil and water do not mix? The reason is because oil is non-polar. The molecules are mainly made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms, and because the difference in electronegativity is so small in the carbon-hydrogen bonds, the bonds are considered non-polar. And as a result, the oil molecules are also nonpolar. Some fats and oils may have a few oxygen and or nitrogen atoms in the molecule, which would then create some polar covalent bonds. But the molecules are mainly comprised of carbon and hydrogen bonds, so much so that the few polar covalent bonds that exist have little effect on the overall polarity of the fat and oil molecules. In general, the non-polar nature of fats and oils means that the molecules do not have a positive end nor a negative end, and so there is no attraction to water. The lack of attraction to water means that fats and oils will not dissolve in water, and so they are described as being hydrophobic. And as one may guess, the term is used for substances that appears to have a phobia or fear towards water. Fats are made up of fatty acid molecules, and the fatty acids have long tails that are made up of mainly carbon and hydrogen atoms, making the tails hydrophobic. Here's an example of lauric acid. Lauric acid is a fatty acid that is mostly made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms, and so the tail here you can see is very hydrophobic. If all the carbon-carbon bonds are single bonds, then the fatty acid would be described as being saturated. If there's at least one carbon-carbon double bond, as in the case here, then the tail can be described as being unsaturated. You may have noticed on a nutrition facts label on various food products that the terms saturated and unsaturated fats are present. These types of fats just refers to the chemical structure of the tail. Fatty acids can have tails with various lengths, but the general rule of thumb is that the longer the hydrophobic tail, the less soluble it is in water. There's a saying that goes, like dissolves like. What that means is polar substances will dissolve in other polar substances, and nonpolar substances will dissolve in other nonpolar substances. But since oil is nonpolar and water is polar, the two are not alike, and so they will not mix. Oil is generally less dense or lighter than water, which is why it is often found floating above the water layer. An example of like dissolves like occurs in histology when microscope slides are prepared. In order to see the tissues that are on the slides, they must first be stained. But during the staining process, the tissues are initially covered in wax, called paraffin, and the stains are not soluble with the wax. The reason is because wax are long carbon chains with hydrogen atoms attached, making them nonpolar. The number of carbons in the wax molecules are anywhere between 20 to 40 carbon atoms. The stain, on the other hand, are polar substances. This would mean the polar stains would not be able to penetrate the nonpolar wax in order to reach the tissues, since the stain and wax would not mix. So how does the stain reach the tissues? The wax is first washed away using a nonpolar organic solvent such as toluene. Toluene is made up of only carbon and hydrogen atoms, as you can see here. And so it is nonpolar, and it's actually a smaller molecule than wax. The toluene is then washed away with ethanol. Ethanol is special in that the hydrophobic part of the molecule, which would be around the carbon and hydrogen atoms, would be soluble with the toluene. The ethanol is then washed away using water. And as we saw earlier, hydrogen bonding can occur between the oxygen-hydrogen group in ethanol with the oxygen and hydrogen atoms in water, making ethanol soluble in water. And then lastly, the staining solution can then be added to the tissues on the slide, because the polar nature of the stain will allow it to be soluble in the water. What happens when you add soap to a mixture of oil and water? The soap will help disperse the oil throughout the water so that you no longer have two layers. It does so due to the structure of the molecules. Soap is made up of a head and a tail. The head has polar bonds and is hydrophilic, and so it is attracted to water. The tail is made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms, making it hydrophobic, and so it is attracted to the oil. In order to mix the oil and the water, the soap molecules will cluster together, forming something called micelles. This here is a micelle. It is sphere-shaped with the hydrophobic tails on the inside, grouped together, trapping the oil and the dirt in the center. The outside of the micelle is made up of the hydrophilic heads so that it can interact with the water. The oil is dispersed into the many micelles, which can then be mixed with the water. This is how oil can be washed away from greasy surfaces. We will now look at acids, bases, and the pH scale. Hydrogen atoms in a chemical reaction can easily lose its electron to become a hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ions are extremely reactive as they can break chemical bonds, they can change the three-dimensional shapes of complex molecules such as proteins, and they can disrupt cell and tissue functions. It's very important to maintain a certain level of hydrogen ions in the body since they affect many of the physiological processes. We'll now have a look at acids and bases, both of which are important substances in chemical and biological systems that influence the hydrogen ion levels. Acids are defined as substances that can release hydrogen ions in water. This means that they can increase the amount of hydrogen ion in solution. Now, acids can be described as being strong or weak. Strong acids will completely dissociate in water. This makes them strong electrolytes, since every acid molecule separates into the respective ions. In this example, hydrochloric acid will completely dissociate into the hydrogen cations and the chloride ions. The water molecules actually help in pulling the ions apart from each other. On the other hand, weak acids do not behave the same way. Most of the acid molecules will actually stay intact. Very few will release hydrogen ions into solution. For this reason, they can be described as being weak electrolytes. If you were to conduct the light bulb test, a solution of a weak acid would result in a dimly lit bulb. In this example, H2CO3 is called carbonic acid. and is considered a weak acid. Most of the molecules will stay intact. Very few will dissociate. But for those that do, the ions that are formed are hydrogen ions and hydrogen carbonate. There's actually carbonic acid in the body. It's formed when carbon dioxide dissolves in water. So when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it can form carbonic acid. So carbon dioxide that is produced in your cells will react with water to form carbonic acid. And then the carbonic acid will then travel to the lungs and eventually be converted back into carbon dioxide so that it can be expelled from the body. These pictures here show the difference between a strong acid and a weak acid. Notice that the strong acid completely dissociates in water, whereas the weak acid has very few dissociations. These are some of the common strong and weak acids. Hydrochloric acid is often used as an example of a strong acid. In the body, it is produced in the stomach, and it helps to destroy the bacteria from the foods that we eat. The strength of the acid actually has nothing to do with the level of danger or how corrosive it is. It only refers to the degree of dissociation when the acid is in solution. Bases are substances that can bind to hydrogen ions, thereby reducing the amount of hydrogen ions in solution. It can also be a substance that produces the OH- ions, also known as hydroxide ions. Bases that reduce the amount of hydrogen ions in solution do so because it has atoms with lone pair of electrons that can attract the ions. And just like acids, bases can also be categorized as being strong or weak. A strong base will completely dissociate in water, which makes them strong electrolytes. Here's an example of a strong base called sodium hydroxide. When it dissolves in water, it'll separate out into the sodium cations and the hydroxide anions. Some common bases you may come across are listed here. Ammonia is considered a weak base, where the lone pair of electrons on the nitrogen atoms on some of the molecules will react with the hydrogen ions in solution. The result is less hydrogen ions in the body. Ammonia is actually produced in the body when proteins are broken down, for example, when you're exercising. It's considered a waste product that will dissolve in water and then be eliminated in the urine. Sodium bicarbonate is another example of a weak base. It absorbs excess hydrogen ion in the stomach contents as the hydrogen ions move into the small intestine. If this absorption does not occur, the hydrogen ions from the hydrochloric acid in the stomach would burn holes in the intestinal tract. The pH scale is used as a measure of the acidity or basicity of solutions. Acids produce hydrogen ions, and so the larger the quantity of ions in solution, the more acidic it is. Bases, on the other hand, absorb hydrogen ions, so the smaller the quantity of the ions in solution, the more basic the solution. When there is an equal amount of hydrogen and hydroxide ions, the two will react to form water. This makes the solution neutral, and so it is neither acidic or basic. The pH scale typically has a range of 0 to 14. Solutions that have a pH of 7 or less is considered acidic. Some of the substances include milk, urine, citrus fruits, vinegar, which is also known as acetic acid, and stomach acids. Stomach acids being extremely acidic. For solutions that have a pH greater than 7, it would be described as being basic. Some basic substances include seawater, bleach, ammonia, oven cleaners, and sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide in oven cleaner is considered extremely basic. For solutions that have equal numbers of hydrogen and hydroxide ions, the pH is equal to 7, and that's considered neutral. Blood has a pH that is normally between 7.35 to 7.45. It's critical that the blood pH is maintained because a pH below 7 can produce a coma, and a pH above 7.8 can cause uncontrollable and sustained skeletal muscle contractions. In summary, a solution is made up of solutes dissolved in a solvent. In the human body, the solvent is water, and it is the most important component since many physiological systems depend on water. Without it, we would die. A body can only survive for a few days without water. Water molecules are polar due to its three-dimensional shape and because the bonds are polar. This results in an attraction between neighboring water molecules and the formation of hydrogen bonds between the negative end around the oxygen atoms with the positive end around the hydrogen atoms in adjacent water molecules. Since water molecules are polar, other polar substances will be attracted to it. That includes sugar and alcohol, as well as ionic compounds. These substances are described as being hydrophilic, and the attraction allows them to readily dissolve in water. Whereas substances that are not polar, such as fats, oils, and waxes, they're considered hydrophobic. They are not attracted to water, and so they don't mix. Remember, to predict whether two substances will mix, the general rule of thumb is that like dissolves like. Substances that release hydrogen ions in water are considered acids, and depending on the degree of dissociation, the acid can be described as being strong or weak. Bases are substances that can reduce the amount of hydrogen ions in water, or produce hydroxide ions. They too can be described as being strong or weak. Lastly, the pH scale indicates the amount of hydrogen ions in solution, and the pH value can represent whether a solution is acidic, basic, or neutral.